The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it was reacting to. I remember gripping the edge of my station so hard that my claws left marks in the metal. On the main screen, a single human ship, barely larger than a cargo shuttle, was moving directly toward our observation post at a speed that made no sense for a species we had classified as primitive only 3 cycles earlier. My name is Kalen Threes, and at the time, I was a junior researcher assigned to the Outer Observation Division of the Ansarian Coalition. Our task was simple: watch new species from a distance, record their behavior, report anything unusual, never make contact unless authorized. We had done this for thousands of years with hundreds of species, and never once had a subject reacted the way the humans did on that day. We had sent a routine scanning drone toward their outer colony, a small moon settlement called Ashgrove Station. It was nothing dangerous, a simple energy pulse, invisible to primitive sensors, meant to measure population density and technological output. We had done this exact procedure on countless worlds. Fish do not notice the shadow of the boat passing far above them. Insects do not notice the footstep before it lands. That is what we believed about humans, too. We were wrong. Within 4 minutes of our drone's pulse, 3 human vessels launched from Ashgrove Station. They were small, unarmored, built for short-range travel only, according to our own data. And yet they moved as if they had been waiting, as if some part of them had expected exactly this moment and had already rehearsed the response 1,000 times in their minds. I remember my supervisor, an older Ansarian named Doran Vec, standing beside me with his 4 eyes fixed on the screen, his breathing slow and controlled the way our people are trained to remain during moments of stress. But even he could not hide the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. "They should not be able to detect that pulse," he said. "Our drones are silent to species below Tier 4 advancement." "Maybe they got lucky," I said, though even as I said it, I did not believe my own words. The human ships did not attack our drone. That was the strange part. They simply escorted it, flying alongside it in a tight formation, all the way to the edge of their system, and then let it go. No hostility, no destruction, just a clear, silent message. "We saw you. We know you are there, and we are not afraid." That single event changed the direction of my entire career, though I did not know it yet. I had spent years studying gentle species, cautious species, species that hid the moment they sensed a larger power nearby. Humans did not hide. They did not celebrate either, as far as our sensors could tell. There was no boasting, no aggressive posturing, no attempt to provoke us further. They simply returned to their routines, as if the moment had barely registered as important. I could not stop thinking about it. That night, in my personal quarters aboard our station, I pulled every scrap of recorded data we had on humanity. It was not much. A handful of long-range scans. Some captured radio signals, mostly entertainment broadcasts and old historical recordings. A basic biological profile, listing average lifespan, that laughably brief window of 80 to 90 cycles. By galactic standards, humans lived and died in the blink of an eye. Most species I studied lived 3, 4, sometimes 10 times as long. I remember thinking, with a strange mixture of pity and curiosity, how strange it must be to live a life so short, so fragile, so temporary. And yet, something about the way they moved on that day, the calm precision of those 3 ships, told me that whatever fragility they carried in their bodies, it did not exist in their minds. 3 days later, I was summoned to a briefing that would change everything. The council chamber aboard our central relay station was a wide, circular room built from pale stone imported from our homeworld, a tradition meant to remind us of who we were even when we traveled far from it. 12 seats surrounded the room, each belonging to a representative species within the Ansarian Coalition. I sat near the back, as junior staff often did, listening more than speaking. The topic was humanity. A representative from the Voss Collective, a species known for their caution and long-term thinking, spoke first. "We recommend continued observation only, no further contact." Their reaction to a simple scan was disproportionate. If a scan alone provokes such a response, direct contact could be unpredictable. A port. A representative from the Threll Assembly, a species far more confident in their own military strength, laughed softly, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Disproportionate? They sent 3 unarmed shuttles to look at a drone. That is not aggression. That is curiosity, perhaps mixed with a little fear. We have encountered far more dramatic reactions from far weaker species. I wanted to speak. I was young, and speaking out of turn in that chamber was not something a junior researcher did lightly, but something pushed me forward, some instinct I could not explain. "If I may," I said, and the room turned toward me, mildly surprised that someone so low in rank had chosen to interrupt. The reaction was not fear. Fear would have caused hesitation, or a retreat, or a request for assistance from a larger power. There was no hesitation. They responded within minutes, with precision, without panic. That is not curiosity or fear. That is readiness. Doran Vec, seated beside me, placed a steadying hand on my arm, a silent warning to not overstep further, but the words were already out. An older Threll representative studied me for a long moment. Readiness for what, young one? They have no idea who we are. They have barely reached the edge of their own solar system with living bodies aboard their ships. I do not know, I admitted, but I do not think their power comes only from their machines. The room fell into a strange silence after that. Some members exchanged glances I could not fully read. Eventually, the council decided on a compromise. A diplomatic team, small and unarmed, would be sent to establish first formal contact with humanity, not to threaten, not to conquer, simply to understand. I was assigned to that team, given my recent observations. I remember the mixture of pride and unease I felt at that appointment. Pride because it was an honor rarely given to someone so young. Unease because some part of me, some quiet and stubborn instinct, told me that we were about to meet something none of our historical records had ever truly prepared us for. The journey to the human homeworld took several weeks using our fastest transport vessel. I spent much of that time reviewing the small amount of cultural material we had gathered from their broadcasts. I watched fragments of their entertainment, listened to their music, studied the strange patterns of their spoken languages. What struck me most was not their technology, which was undeniably behind our own by centuries. It was their stories. Nearly every piece of human fiction I studied involved struggle, a weaker group facing a stronger one and refusing to give up. Individuals sacrificing comfort, safety, sometimes their own lives, for people they loved or even for strangers they had never met. I had studied dozens of species before humanity, and while many valued courage in some form, none of them centered their entire cultural identity around the idea of refusing to surrender, no matter the cost. I mentioned this to Doran Vec one evening as our ship cruised silently through the dark between stars. He listened patiently, as he always did, his 4 eyes half closed in thought. Every species tells stories about what they fear and what they hope for, he said. Perhaps their stories simply reflect a violent history. A species that fought often among themselves might naturally create stories about fighting. Perhaps, I said, but there is something else. In almost every story, the ones who refuse to give up are not the strongest characters. They are often the smallest, the weakest, the most overlooked, and yet the stories always end with them succeeding, not because they became stronger than their enemy, but because they endured longer, or found a way around the obstacle no one expected. Doran considered this for a long moment. You believe this shapes how they think, not just how they tell stories, but how they act. I believe it might, I said, and if I am right, then our assumption that fewer years of life means less resolve may be the greatest mistake this coalition has ever made. He did not answer that night, but I noticed he requested additional files on human history before we docked at the edge of their solar system 3 days later. Our first physical meeting took place in a neutral orbital station humans had built specifically for the occasion, a small structure, hastily assembled, but efficient, clearly designed by minds that valued function over appearance. I remember stepping through the connecting corridor, my breathing steady despite the nervous energy running through my body, and seeing them for the first time in person rather than through a screen. They were smaller than I expected, softer looking, with strange smooth skin and expressive faces that seemed to shift with every emotion, unlike the more controlled expressions of my own people. A woman named Grace Whitfield led their delegation, along with a man named Peter Langley, both representatives of what they called the Unified Human Assembly, a governing body that had apparently formed not long after their first true contact with the wider universe through our scanning drone. Grace extended her hand toward me, a strange gesture I had read about but never experienced. I hesitated only a moment before understanding and reaching out to meet it. Her grip was firm, warmer than I expected, and her eyes, a shade of blue I had never seen on any other species, studied me with open curiosity rather than fear. "You must be the one who argued we were not afraid," she said, and I felt a small jolt of surprise. Somehow, word of my comments in the council chamber had reached them already, though I would later learn humans had their own methods of gathering information, quiet and thorough in ways we had underestimated. "I only said what the evidence suggested," I replied carefully. She smiled, a small knowing expression. "Good, because you were right, and you would be wise to remember that for whatever happens next." I did not fully understand what she meant by those words at the time. I only knew that standing there, surrounded by a species we had once dismissed as fragile and short-lived, I felt for the first time in my long career a genuine sense that the universe I thought I understood was about to change in ways none of us had predicted. Little did I know that this first meeting, calm and careful as it was, would be only the beginning. Within the following months, events would unfold that none of our historical archives could have prepared us for. A single act of arrogance from within our own coalition would ignite something in humanity that no species in recorded galactic history had ever truly witnessed. And I, a junior researcher who had simply noticed a strange pattern in old stories, would find myself standing at the center of it all, watching as the quiet species we once pitied revealed exactly why the wider universe would never look at them the same way again. The trouble began 6 months after that first meeting, and it did not begin with humanity at all. It began with a Threll fleet commander named Doss Kareth, a man whose confidence had never once been tested by failure, and whose pride would soon cost the entire galaxy far more than he could have imagined. I had returned to my post at the relay station by then, continuing to compile data on human culture, their history, their strange and endless capacity for both kindness and stubbornness. Diplomatic relations between the Ansarian Coalition and the Unified Human Assembly were still new, still fragile, built on careful agreements about trade routes and shared information. Humanity had not yet joined the coalition formally. They remained outside it, watching us as carefully as we watched them, neither side fully trusting the other, but neither side hostile either. That fragile peace shattered on the day Threll forces attacked a small human research outpost near the edge of neutral space. I learned the details slowly, piece by piece, through official reports that grew more troubling with each update. The outpost, named Camden Reach, was a modest facility, home to fewer than 200 human scientists and support staff studying stellar formations in a region considered too dangerous for larger colonies. It had no weapons capable of threatening a starship. It had no military value. It existed purely for scientific purpose. Commander Kareth's fleet had been patrolling the edge of Threll territory when they detected the outpost. According to the official Threll report, they believed the humans had drifted into contested space without proper authorization, a claim that later proved to be false, based on records humanity provided showing Camden Reach had been established with full knowledge and approval from the Coalition years earlier. But Kareth did not check those records before acting. He simply saw a small, undefended human outpost, and something in his mind decided this was an opportunity to demonstrate Threll dominance to a species he considered beneath serious concern. His fleet fired on the outpost's shield generators first, disabling their defenses within minutes. Then came the boarding parties, armed and demanding surrender, treating the human scientists as prisoners rather than as citizens of a species with whom the Coalition maintained active diplomatic relations. Several humans were injured during the confrontation, None were killed, a fact the Threll would later cite in their defense, as if restraint, after committing the initial act of aggression, somehow excused it. I remember the moment the news reached our station. Doran Vec called me into his office, his 4 eyes heavy with something I had rarely seen in him before. Concern, yes, but also something closer to dread. "They have made a terrible mistake," he said quietly. "The Threll believe they have simply reminded a young species of its place," I replied, though even as I spoke, I felt the same unease growing in my chest. "No," Doran said. "I mean humanity. I fear they are about to make us understand exactly what we misjudged." Word of the attack spread through human communication networks within hours, far faster than any of us anticipated, given their technological limitations. I later learned that human civilization had developed something we had underestimated entirely, a deeply interconnected information system that allowed nearly every person on their homeworld and colonies to learn of major events almost instantly. There was no controlling the narrative, no quiet diplomatic containment possible. Every human, from their highest officials to ordinary citizens working simple jobs, knew within a day that their people had been attacked and treated as prisoners on a peaceful research station. The response from the unified human assembly came swiftly, but not in the way any of us expected. There were no declarations of war, no dramatic broadcasts filled with anger. Grace Whitfield, the same woman who had greeted me during our first meeting, appeared in a recorded statement that was shared across every network, human and coalition alike. I remember watching that recording more times than I could count, studying every subtle shift in her expression, trying to understand what it meant. "We do not seek conflict," she said, her voice calm, steady, without a trace of the fear or fury I expected. "We have always believed that patience and understanding are the foundations of peace between different peoples. But patience is not the same as acceptance, and understanding does not mean we will allow our people to be harmed without consequence. Commander Kareth and his fleet violated agreed boundaries and caused injury to unarmed scientists. We ask the Threll Assembly to acknowledge this action and provide appropriate accountability. We hope this can be resolved through proper channels." Wait. It sounded, on the surface, like the same careful diplomatic language every species used when trying to avoid escalation. But something in her tone, something in the specific phrasing of her words, sent a small chill through me. She did not ask for an apology. She did not request compensation, as most coalition species would in a similar situation. She asked for accountability, a subtle but important distinction I would only fully understand later. The Threll Assembly, confident in their military strength and dismissive of what they still viewed as a primitive species, responded with what I can only describe as arrogant indifference. Their official statement acknowledged the incident, but framed it as a minor territorial misunderstanding, offering no real accountability, no consequences for Commander Kareth, and no meaningful gesture toward the humans who had been harmed. I remember discussing this with Doran Vec in the observation deck of our station, watching the distant lights of passing ships while we spoke. "They believe humanity has no way to force accountability," Doran said. "No significant military presence beyond their own solar system, no allies willing to intervene on their behalf. From the Threll perspective, this is a conflict with only one possible outcome." "And from your perspective?" I asked. Doran was quiet for a long moment. "I do not think the Threll understand what they are dealing with. I do not think any of us fully understand yet." 3 weeks passed with no further public statement from humanity. Diplomatic channels remained open, technically, though human representatives grew quieter, more measured in their communications. I remember feeling a strange sense of anticipation building within me during those weeks, a feeling I could not quite name, somewhere between fascination and fear. Then, on what should have been an ordinary morning, everything changed. A single human vessel appeared at the edge of Threll-patrolled space, a ship unlike anything in our recorded databases. It did not match any known human design. Later analysis would reveal that humanity had spent those 3 quiet weeks not negotiating, but building, drawing on technology and resources they had kept hidden from outside observation, refined through generations of careful, quiet development that our coalition scanners had simply never detected because we had never thought to look closely enough at a species we considered too far behind to matter. The ship approached a Threll outpost stationed near the boundary of contested space, the same region where Camden Reach had been attacked. It made no aggressive maneuvers. It simply broadcast a single message, repeated on an open channel that every listening station in the region, including our own, could receive. I still remember the voice that delivered that message. It was Peter Langley, calm, measured, entirely without the anger I expected. "This is a formal notice," he said. "Commander Kareth and the personnel involved in the attack on Camden Reach have been given 3 separate opportunities to acknowledge responsibility through official channels. Each request has been dismissed or ignored. We are left with no further diplomatic avenue. What follows is not an act of war against the Threll people. It is a response, proportionate and limited, intended solely to demonstrate that harm against our citizens carries consequence, regardless of how small our presence in this galaxy may currently appear." I remember Doran Vec turning to me, his expression unreadable. "Proportionate," he repeated softly. "They are being careful even now." What happened next unfolded over the course of a single hour, an hour that would be studied by military historians of every species for generations to come. The human vessel did not attack the Threll outpost directly. Instead, it deployed a series of smaller craft, each moving with a precision that suggested extensive planning rather than improvised aggression. These craft targeted only military installations directly linked to Commander Karath's fleet, disabling weapon systems, communication arrays, and propulsion units with what appeared to be non-lethal precision strikes. Not a single Threll life was lost during the entire engagement. Every ship belonging to Kareth's personal command was left drifting, powerless, but intact. Then, in a move that stunned every observer watching from surrounding systems, the human vessel transmitted the coordinates of Kareth's disabled fleet to the nearest Threll rescue command, along with a simple message. "Your people are unharmed but require assistance. We trust you will see to their safety, as we saw to the safety of ours during your attack on Camden Reach, despite the circumstances." I sat in stunned silence in our observation room, watching the data stream in from multiple sources, confirming what had happened. The Threll fleet, a force that had spent decades building a reputation for military dominance throughout the region, had been rendered completely helpless by a species they considered primitive, without a single fatality, and then handed back to their own people with what almost felt like a lesson embedded in the gesture itself. "They could have destroyed that fleet," I said quietly. "Every ship, every life aboard them, and they chose not to." Doran nodded slowly. "I believe that was the point. They wanted the Threll, and everyone watching, to understand something important. This was not a demonstration of what they were capable of destroying. It was a demonstration of what they were capable of choosing not to destroy." The reaction across the wider galaxy was immediate and varied. Some coalition members expressed quiet admiration for what they saw as remarkable restraint paired with undeniable capability. Others, particularly among more militant species, viewed the incident as a dangerous show of unpredictable power from a species whose true limits remained unknown to any of us. The Threll Assembly, humiliated in a way that no amount of official statements could soften, issued a formal apology to the Unified Human Assembly within days, along with acknowledgement of Commander Kareth's misconduct and a promise of appropriate consequences for those responsible. Humanity's response to that apology was, once again, unexpectedly measured. Grace Whitfield's second recorded statement contained no triumph, no lingering anger, simply a quiet acknowledgement that the matter was considered resolved, and a hope that future interactions between their peoples could proceed with mutual respect. I remember reviewing every piece of that entire sequence of events dozens of times in the weeks that followed, trying to understand the deeper pattern behind it all. It was not simply that humanity possessed hidden strength, though that alone would have been enough to shift the balance of power across known space. It was the way they used that strength, precise, restrained, focused entirely on consequence rather than destruction, on protection rather than domination. I began to understand, slowly and with a growing sense of unease, that we had spent years studying humanity through the wrong lens entirely. We had measured them by the age of their technology, the brevity of their lives, the modest size of their territory. We had never once considered measuring them by the depth of their resolve, the precision of their restraint, or the quiet, terrifying calm with which they responded to harm done against their people. Doran Vec, standing beside me as we reviewed the final reports from that incident, spoke words I would carry with me for the rest of my career. "We have been asking the wrong question all along," he said. "We kept asking how strong humanity might become given more time. We should have been asking what happens when a species already possesses great strength, but has simply chosen, until now, never to show it." I did not yet understand how right he was. That understanding would come later, during events far more significant than the incident at Camden Reach, events that would force every species in the known galaxy to confront exactly what kind of power had been quietly growing within humanity all along, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally be needed. The request came to me directly, which surprised everyone in my department far more than it surprised me. Grace Whitfield had asked, through official coalition channels, that I be assigned as a liaison researcher to a small human settlement called Windmere Colony, established recently on a moon within their own solar system. She wanted, in her words, someone who had already demonstrated an ability to see humanity clearly, rather than through the assumptions carried by most of the wider galaxy. Doran Vec approved the assignment without hesitation, though I noticed a flicker of something in his expression when he handed me the transfer documents. Pride, perhaps, mixed with a quiet worry he did not voice aloud. "You will see things there that our reports cannot capture," he said. "Watch carefully, listen more than you speak, and Kalen, remember that understanding a species does not mean predicting them perfectly. Even they may surprise you." I arrived at Windmere Colony 3 weeks later, stepping off a transport shuttle onto soil that felt strange beneath my feet, lighter than my homeworld, the air carrying a faint metallic scent from nearby mining operations. The colony itself was modest by galactic standards, a collection of domed structures housing perhaps 3,000 people, along with agricultural facilities and a small research station where much of humanity's quiet technological development had apparently taken place over previous decades. Grace Whitfield met me personally at the landing pad, accompanied by a tall man with graying hair named Nathaniel Cole, who I would later learn served as the colony's chief engineer and one of the original architects behind the vessel that had disabled Commander Karath's fleet. "Welcome to Windmere," Grace said, extending her hand as she had during our first meeting months earlier. "I imagine you have many questions." "More than I know how to organize," I admitted. She smiled, a warmth in her expression that I had come to recognize as genuine rather than diplomatic performance. "Then let us start simply. Walk with me." Over the following weeks, I lived among the human population of Windmere Colony, sharing meals with families, observing their daily routines, attending community gatherings, and slowly building relationships that felt entirely different from the careful, measured interactions of coalition diplomacy. I met a young woman named Emma Bracewell, who taught children in the colony's small school and spoke to me at length about human history, not the sanitized version presented in official records, but the complicated, painful, and often inspiring true account of a species that had spent thousands of years fighting among itself before finally learning to turn that same intensity toward something greater. "We were not always united," Emma told me one evening as we sat together in the colony's communal garden, watching artificial lights mimic the slow fade of a sunset that did not naturally occur on this moon. "For most of our history, we fought each other constantly. Different nations, different beliefs, different resources we all wanted for ourselves. It took us a very long time to understand that the same fire that made us fight one another could be turned toward protecting one another instead." "And that fire," I asked carefully, "is what allowed your people to build the ship that disabled an entire Threll fleet without loss of life?" Emma nodded slowly. "That, and something else. Purpose. We do not build weapons because we crave power over others. We build them because throughout our entire history, every time we let our guard down completely, someone eventually took advantage of that weakness. We learned, generation after generation, that peace without the capacity to protect it is simply an invitation for someone else to take it from you. I thought often about those words during my time at Windmere. They echoed something Doran Vec had said before I left, and something I had begun to suspect myself after studying humanity's fictional stories all those months earlier. This was not a species defined by aggression. It was a species defined by an unwillingness to be broken, shaped by a long and difficult history that had taught them, repeatedly and painfully, exactly what happened when they were unprepared. Nathaniel Cole, the colony's chief engineer, proved to be one of my most valuable sources of understanding, though he was initially reluctant to speak with me at length, his manner gruff and guarded in ways that reminded me of Doran Vec's own careful caution. It took several weeks of shared meals and quiet observation before he finally opened up during a night shift at the colony's small shipyard, where a portion of humanity's continuing technological development took place. "You want to know how we built that ship," he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact, as he adjusted a component on a training vessel used to prepare young engineers. "I want to understand why you built it the way you did," I said. "Why restraint when overwhelming force was available to you?" Nathaniel set down his tools and looked at me directly, his expression serious. "Because destruction is easy, Kalen. Any species with enough power can destroy something. What takes real strength is having that power available to you, and choosing precisely how much of it to use, and no more. We did not want the galaxy to fear us as monsters. We wanted them to understand something more important, that we could protect what mattered to us without needing to become something we would regret." "And if restraint had not been enough," I asked, "if the Threll had continued their aggression regardless?" His expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Then we would have done what was necessary. But we do not start from that place. We start from the belief that most conflicts can be resolved without loss of life, if the other side understands clearly that continued aggression carries real consequence. Kareth's fleet was disabled, not destroyed, because that was sufficient to make our point. Had they continued, had they refused the lesson entirely, the outcome would have been different." I found myself both reassured and unsettled by his words. Reassured, because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that humanity's capacity for overwhelming force was matched by an equally strong internal commitment to using it responsibly. Unsettled, because it meant the true limits of that force remained, even after everything I had witnessed, largely unknown to me and to the wider galaxy. It was during my final weeks at Windmere Colony that the true depth of humanity's character revealed itself to me in a way no official report or historical record could have prepared me for. A mining accident occurred at one of the colony's remote extraction sites, a collapse within a deep tunnel that trapped 11 workers beneath layers of unstable rock. I remember the alarm sounding through the colony's central network and the immediate, unified response that followed. Within minutes, nearly every available engineer, medical worker, and volunteer had mobilized toward the site, coordinating rescue efforts with a speed and precision that reminded me, uncomfortably, of the same readiness I had witnessed during the response to our scanning drone all those months earlier. I joined the response effort myself, unable to offer much practical assistance given my unfamiliarity with human rescue equipment, but determined to witness what unfolded. For nearly 18 hours, teams of humans worked in continuous rotation, digging carefully through unstable rock, monitoring air quality within the collapsed tunnel, and maintaining constant communication with the trapped workers to keep their spirits steady during the long, uncertain wait. Nathaniel Cole led much of the engineering effort personally, refusing to rest despite clear exhaustion, driven by what I came to understand was not simply professional duty, but genuine, personal investment in the safety of people he considered part of his community. Emma Bracewell organized food and support for the exhausted rescue workers, along with comfort for the families of those trapped below, many of whom gathered near the site despite officials gently suggesting they wait elsewhere. I remember standing beside Grace Whitfield during the final hours of the rescue, watching as the last trapped worker, a young man barely out of adolescence, was finally pulled free from the collapsed tunnel to the sound of exhausted, overwhelming relief from everyone gathered at the site. "This is what you were trying to show me," I said quietly, watching the scene unfold. "Not the ship, not the fleet you disabled. This." Grace turned to look at me, her expression tired but genuine. "The ship protects us from threats beyond our world. This protects us from threats within it. Both come from the same place, Kaylin. We do not leave our people behind, not from danger beyond the stars, and not from danger beneath our own feet." I returned to my quarters that night unable to sleep, my mind turning over everything I had witnessed during my time at Windmere Colony. I thought of the mining accident, the effort humanity poured into rescuing 11 people from beneath collapsed rock. I thought of Camden Reach, the outpost of scientists who had been attacked without provocation. I thought of Commander Careth's fleet, disabled but spared, returned to Threll custody with what almost felt like a lesson wrapped inside an act of mercy. I began to understand, more clearly than any coalition report had ever allowed me to understand, that humanity's fury, the thing our historical archives had so badly misjudged, was never simply about aggression or dominance. It was protection, given shape and force. It was love, transformed into readiness. A species that valued every single life within its community so deeply that harm against even one person could summon a response capable of disabling an entire fleet without a single fatality, and yet that same depth of care could also mobilize hundreds of people to spend 18 exhausting hours digging through unstable rock to save 11 miners most of the galaxy would never even know existed. I wrote extensive reports during those final weeks at Windmere, attempting to communicate this understanding back to the Coalition Council, though I suspected, even as I compiled them, that written words alone could never fully capture what I had witnessed firsthand. Doran Vec read every report I sent, responding with careful, thoughtful questions that suggested he, too, was beginning to reconsider decades of assumptions built on incomplete information. It was during my last conversation with Grace Whitfield, before returning to my own people, that she said something I have carried with me ever since. Words that would prove more significant than either of us realized at the time. "You asked me once, indirectly, through your reports and questions, what would happen if restraint was not enough," she said, as we stood together watching the artificial sunset one final time. "I want you to understand something clearly before you leave, Kaylin. We hope it never comes to that. We have built our entire civilization around the belief that most conflicts can be resolved without loss of life, that most threats can be answered with precision rather than devastation. But should a moment ever arrive where restraint truly fails, where an enemy leaves us no path toward peaceful resolution, I want you to understand what that would mean." "What would it mean?" I asked, though some part of me already sensed I did not fully want the answer. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, focused on something beyond the artificial horizon. "It would mean that every ounce of care we have ever shown, every restraint we have ever practiced, every life we have ever chosen to spare when we could have taken it instead, would be replaced entirely by a single, unified purpose. Not conquest, not domination, simply the absolute, undivided determination to ensure that whatever threatened us, whatever threatened the people we love, would never be capable of doing so again." I returned to my post at the relay station shortly after that conversation, carrying with me an understanding of humanity that no historical archive, no coalition briefing, and no distant observation could have ever provided. I did not yet know that within a matter of months, that understanding would be tested in ways none of us, not even the humans themselves, could have fully anticipated. The attack came without warning, and it did not come from the Threll, nor from any species we had previously considered a serious threat to galactic stability. It came from a coalition of smaller factions calling themselves the Verdane Accord, a loose alliance of pirate fleets and rogue military remnants that had spent decades operating on the fringes of known space, avoiding direct conflict with larger powers while preying on weaker, undefended targets. I learned of the attack while reviewing routine reports at the relay station, barely 3 months after returning from Windmere Colony. The Verdane Accord had launched a coordinated assault on 3 separate human colonies simultaneously, striking during a period when much of humanity's attention remained focused on continuing diplomatic negotiations with the wider coalition. It was, by every measure our analysts could determine, a calculated act of opportunism, a belief that humanity's newly demonstrated strength remained isolated to a single defensive vessel, and that their broader territory remained vulnerable to a large, coordinated strike. They were wrong in ways that would reshape the balance of power across the known galaxy. The first reports reaching our station were fragmented, chaotic, filled with the kind of uncertainty that always accompanies a sudden, unexpected act of aggression. Verdane forces had struck Camden Reach again, the same research outpost attacked previously by Commander Kareth, now rebuilt and expanded following the Threll incident. Simultaneously, they struck a mining colony on the outer edge of human territory, and a small agricultural settlement that housed several thousand civilians with minimal defensive capability. I remember standing beside Doran Vec in our observation room, watching the initial data stream in, both of us silent as the scale of the coordinated attack became clear. 3 targets, Doran said quietly, struck within minutes of one another. This was planned carefully, over a significant period of time. They believe humanity's strength is limited to a single demonstration, I said. A single ship, disabled and returned mercifully. They think restraint means limitation. Doran's expression darkened. Then they have made the same mistake as Commander Kareth, only far more severe in scale. The Verdane Accord's initial assault caused genuine harm, unlike the earlier confrontation with the Threll. Civilian casualties occurred at the agricultural settlement, where defensive capabilities were minimal and the attacking forces showed none of the restraint humanity itself had demonstrated during their response to Karath's fleet. Reports indicated dozens of injuries among colonists, along with significant damage to critical infrastructure, leaving thousands without adequate shelter or resources during the attack's immediate aftermath. I watched the human response unfold not through official statements or diplomatic channels, but through the same interconnected communication network that had first surprised me during the Camden Reach incident. Within hours, every available human resource across their solar system began mobilizing, not in a chaotic scramble, but with the same disciplined precision I had witnessed during the mining accident rescue at Windmere Colony, scaled now to a level I had never previously imagined possible. Nathaniel Cole, who I had come to know personally during my time at Windmere, appeared in a brief recorded update that reached coalition networks within the first day of the crisis. His expression carried none of the calm reassurance I remembered from our conversations. Instead, there was a controlled intensity in his eyes that unsettled me more than open anger ever could have. "We have identified the responsible parties," he said. "We know their staging locations, their supply routes, and their command structure. What happens next will not be swift, because that is not our way. It will be thorough." I understood, watching that brief message, exactly what he meant. Humanity was not simply responding to an attack. They were preparing to dismantle, methodically and completely, an entire network of aggression that had preyed upon vulnerable populations across the galaxy for decades, an achievement no coalition military force had managed despite generations of effort. Over the following weeks, I watched reports arrive from across known space describing human military operations unlike anything our historical archives had prepared us for. Rather than launching a single overwhelming assault, humanity's forces moved with patient, calculated precision, striking Verdane's supply lines first, cutting off their ability to resupply or retreat before ever engaging their primary combat forces directly. Communication networks were disrupted with surgical accuracy, isolating individual Verdane factions from one another, preventing coordinated resistance. Doran Vec and I reviewed these reports together each evening, both of us increasingly aware that we were witnessing something the wider galaxy would study for generations to come. "They are not fighting to destroy," Doran observed one evening, studying a tactical analysis compiled by our own military advisors. "They are fighting to dismantle an entire system of harm, piece by piece, ensuring it cannot simply reform once the immediate conflict ends. They learned this from their own history, I said, remembering Emma Bracewell's words from our time together at Winmere Colony. Centuries of internal conflict taught them that eliminating an immediate threat without addressing its underlying structure only guarantees its eventual return. The most significant engagement of the entire campaign occurred nearly a month after the initial attack, when human forces finally located and confronted the primary Verdane command fleet, hidden within a remote asteroid field they had used as a staging ground for years. I remember watching the tactical data arrive in real time, shared openly with coalition observers as part of an agreement humanity had established to maintain transparency during the conflict. The Verdane fleet, larger and more heavily armed than any force humanity had previously confronted, initially believed themselves capable of withstanding a direct human assault. Their confidence proved catastrophically misplaced. Human forces, employing tactics and technology that remained largely unknown even to coalition analysts, systematically disabled the Verdane fleet's defensive and offensive capabilities within a matter of hours, employing the same combination of precision and restraint I had witnessed during the earlier confrontation with Commander Karath. What followed, however, differed significantly from that earlier incident. Rather than simply disabling the fleet and departing, human forces conducted a thorough operation to identify and detain key leadership figures within the Verdane Accord, ensuring accountability for the harm caused to human civilians during the initial attack. Civilian casualties among Verdane forces remained remarkably low throughout the entire engagement, a fact that impressed even the most skeptical coalition military analysts, though the operation itself left no doubt about the thoroughness of humanity's capability when genuinely provoked. I remember a conversation with Doran Vec shortly after the conclusion of that engagement, both of us reviewing the final reports together in the quiet of our observation room. "They could have destroyed that fleet entirely," Doran said. "Every ship, every life aboard them. Instead, they chose thoroughness over destruction, accountability over annihilation." "Because destruction alone does not solve the underlying problem," I said, echoing his own earlier observation. "It simply removes one threat while leaving the conditions that created it unchanged. Humanity understands something that many older, more established powers within our own coalition have never fully grasped. Real strength lies not in the capacity for destruction, but in the wisdom to know when destruction serves no true purpose." News of humanity's response to the Verdane Accord spread rapidly across the known galaxy, reaching every corner of coalition space within weeks. The reaction among various species varied considerably, reflecting the same divide that had emerged following the earlier Threll incident. Some viewed humanity's methodical, restrained approach as a sign of admirable discipline, evidence of a species that could be trusted as a genuine ally rather than feared as an unpredictable threat. Others, particularly among species whose own military doctrines relied heavily on overwhelming force and rapid destruction, viewed humanity's patient thoroughness as somehow more unsettling than outright aggression would have been. I remember a conversation with a Voss Collective representative during a brief coalition gathering shortly after the conflict's conclusion, a cautious, thoughtful individual named Celis Doran, no relation to my own supervisor despite the similarity in name. "There is something deeply unsettling about a species that fights with such patience," Celis said, her voice carrying genuine unease rather than simple curiosity. "Most aggressive species act from impulse, from anger, from a desire for immediate resolution. Humanity acts from calculation, from careful planning extended over weeks or months, arriving at the same devastating result, but through methods that suggest an almost frightening level of discipline." "I understand your concern," I said, "but consider what that discipline has consistently produced. Restraint when overwhelming force was available, mercy toward defeated enemies who showed no mercy themselves, accountability sought rather than simple vengeance pursued. If this is the nature of humanity's fury, then perhaps what should unsettle us is not their capability, but our own history of assuming capability alone determines character." Celis considered this for a long moment before responding. Perhaps you are right, though I suspect it will take considerable time before the wider coalition fully accepts that assessment. She proved correct in that prediction. Despite the clear evidence of humanity's restraint and precision throughout both major conflicts, a significant portion of the coalition remained wary, uncertain how to categorize a species whose power had grown so quickly, so quietly, and had proven itself capable of reshaping entire military balances within the span of less than a single year. I returned to my ongoing research following the conclusion of the Verdane conflict, continuing to document and analyze humanity's actions with the same careful attention I had applied since our first encounter with their scanning response so many months earlier. I did not yet know that the most significant test of humanity's character, and the moment that would finally determine how the entire galaxy would understand their place among the stars, still lay ahead of us, arriving from a source none of us had ever considered a genuine threat. The final test came from within our own coalition, and it arrived in a form none of us had anticipated, carried not by an outside threat, but by fear itself, the oldest and most dangerous weapon any civilization can turn against another. A faction within the Threll Assembly, still humiliated by their earlier defeat and unwilling to accept the new balance of power that had emerged following humanity's decisive response to both Commander Kareth and the Verdane Accord, began quietly organizing support among other coalition members who shared their growing anxiety about humanity's rapid rise. Their argument was simple, and to many frightened minds within the coalition, disturbingly persuasive. A species capable of disabling an entire fleet without loss of life, and later dismantling an established criminal network within a matter of weeks, possessed power that no single unaligned civilization should be permitted to hold indefinitely. Better, they argued, to contain that power now, while humanity remained isolated to a single solar system, than to wait until their reach extended further into the wider galaxy. I learned of this growing movement through Doran Vec, who had been invited to a series of closed council sessions I was not senior enough to attend directly, though he shared with me afterward what had been discussed, his expression heavy with concern each time. They speak of containment, he told me one evening, as though humanity were a natural disaster to be managed, rather than a civilization to be understood. Some have proposed a coordinated blockade of human territory, restricting their access to coalition trade routes and resources, framed publicly as a precautionary measure for galactic stability. That is not containment, I said. That is provocation disguised as caution. I know, Doran said quietly, and I fear the consequences of that disguise will prove far more costly than anyone proposing it currently understands. The blockade was implemented 3 weeks later, coordinated quietly among a coalition of Threll sympathizers and several smaller fearful factions who believed collective action offered protection against a power they did not fully understand. Human trade vessels attempting to access established coalition routes were turned away, their diplomatic credentials suddenly deemed insufficient, their requests for passage denied under a series of newly implemented, deliberately vague security regulations. I remember watching the human response unfold with a mixture of dread and reluctant admiration. There was no immediate retaliation, no dramatic show of force in response to the blockade's implementation. Instead, Grace Whitfield issued a public statement, calm and measured as always, requesting formal clarification from the Coalition Council regarding the sudden and unexplained restriction of previously agreed trade access. The Coalition's response, driven largely by the Threll faction's continued influence, offered only vague justifications about regional security concerns, refusing to acknowledge the blockade's true purpose or provide any timeline for its resolution. I attended, as an observer, a tense exchange between Grace Whitfield and several coalition representatives conducted through a secure diplomatic channel roughly 1 month into the blockade. I remember the quiet, controlled frustration in her voice, a tone I had not heard from her during any of our previous interactions. "We have honored every agreement made between our peoples since our first contact," she said. "We have shown restraint when restraint was possible, precision when force became necessary, and mercy toward those who sought to harm us without provocation." We ask now simply for honesty. If this coalition genuinely fears what humanity has become, then say so directly and allow us the opportunity to address those fears through open conversation. But do not disguise fear as policy, and do not mistake our patience for an absence of consequence. The coalition representatives present offered no direct response, retreating instead into the same vague bureaucratic language that had justified the blockade from its inception. I remember watching Grace's expression during that final unproductive exchange and recognizing in her eyes something I had seen only once before, during our final conversation at Windmere Colony, when she had spoken of what might happen should restraint ever truly fail. Humanity's response, when it finally arrived, was neither the devastating military action some coalition members privately feared, nor the passive acceptance others had mistakenly assumed would follow, given humanity's consistent pattern of restraint. Instead, it was something far more unsettling in its implications, precisely because it required no violence whatsoever to demonstrate its point. Within days, every human trade agreement, every shared technological exchange, every cooperative scientific initiative that had been established between humanity and coalition members over the previous year was formally suspended. Human engineers withdrew from several joint research projects that had proven remarkably valuable to coalition scientific advancement. Human medical technology, which had already begun demonstrating breakthrough applications in treating several previously incurable coalition illnesses, was quietly removed from ongoing collaborative trials. The impact was immediate and far more damaging to coalition interests than anyone had anticipated. Several member species, entirely uninvolved in the Threll faction's push for blockade, found themselves suddenly cut off from resources and knowledge that had become genuinely valuable during the short period of cooperation. Public pressure within these unaffected coalition territories grew rapidly, as citizens and officials alike began questioning why a policy driven by a small faction's fear had resulted in tangible losses across the entire coalition. I remember Doran Vec explaining the deeper significance of this response during one of our evening conversations, his understanding of humanity clearly having grown as thoroughly as my own over the preceding months. They did not need to raise a single weapon, he said, something close to genuine respect coloring his voice. They simply demonstrated, through absence rather than action, exactly how much value their cooperation truly provided, and in doing so, they revealed the blockade for what it always was, an act of fear that cost the entire coalition far more than it ever protected. Within 6 weeks, the pressure from unaffected coalition members, combined with the tangible losses experienced across multiple territories, forced a full council session to address the growing crisis. I attended this session personally, granted permission given my extensive research and direct experience among human populations. The debate that unfolded within that circular stone chamber remains, even now, one of the most significant moments I have ever witnessed in coalition history. The Threll faction, along with their remaining sympathizers, attempted to justify the continued blockade, citing ongoing concerns about humanity's unchecked military capability. But their arguments, once persuasive to a frightened majority, now met open skepticism from representatives whose territories had suffered genuine, measurable harm from the policy's consequences. It was Celis Doran, the same Voss Collective representative who had once expressed unease about humanity's patient discipline, who ultimately delivered the argument that shifted the Council's final decision. We feared humanity because their strength grew quickly, and because we could not predict its limits, she said, addressing the full Council with a clarity I had not previously witnessed from her. But in every single instance since our first contact, they have demonstrated precisely how they intend to use that strength. Restraint toward the Threll, thoroughness against genuine criminal threats. And now, when faced with an unjust and unexplained restriction of their agreed rights, they chose not violence, but simply the honest withdrawal of value they were never obligated to provide in the first place. If this is what humanity's fury looks like, then I believe we have spent the past year fearing exactly the wrong thing. The blockade was formally dissolved within days of that session, accompanied by a rare, direct apology issued to the Unified Human Assembly by the full Coalition Council, acknowledging that fear, rather than evidence, had driven the policy's implementation. Humanity's response to that apology, delivered once again through Grace Whitfield, remains among the words I have carried with me most closely throughout the remainder of my career. "We understand fear," she said. "Our own history is filled with moments when fear drove us toward decisions we later regretted deeply. We do not hold this against the coalition as a whole, nor against any individual species who acted from genuine concern rather than malice. We ask only that moving forward, judgment be built upon evidence rather than assumption, and that trust, once earned through consistent action, be extended with the same patience we have tried to offer throughout every challenge we have faced since first meeting your people." I returned to my permanent research position at the relay station shortly after the blockade's dissolution, carrying with me an understanding of humanity that few within the wider coalition could claim to share so completely. Over the following years, as formal alliance agreements were eventually established between humanity and the broader coalition, I often found myself reflecting on everything I had witnessed during that remarkable first year of true contact between our peoples. We had begun by pitying humanity, dismissing their brief lives and modest technology as evidence of a species destined to remain minor among the vast community of civilizations populating the known galaxy. We ended that year having witnessed a species whose quiet strength, patient discipline, and unwavering commitment to protecting those they loved had reshaped fundamental assumptions about power itself across every corner of coalition space. Doran Vec retired from active research not long after those events, though we remained close throughout the following years, often discussing how thoroughly our initial assumptions about humanity had been proven wrong. During one of our final conversations before his passing, years later, he shared an observation that has remained with me ever since, one I believe captures the true meaning behind everything I witnessed during that pivotal year. "We measured humanity by the length of their lives," he said, "and found them wanting. We should have measured them instead by the depth of what they were willing to protect, and we would have understood immediately that we stood before something the galaxy had never truly encountered." I think of those words often, even now, decades after first witnessing 3 small human ships escort our silent observation drone back to the edge of their solar system, a simple, quiet gesture that I now understand carried within it every truth we would eventually learn about humanity's character. They were never driven by a desire for conquest or dominance. They were driven by something far more powerful and far more enduring, a fierce, unwavering commitment to the safety and dignity of every single person within their care, extended eventually, through patient demonstration and consistent restraint, to encompass an entire galaxy that had once dismissed them as insignificant. That, I have come to believe, is why humanity's fury shook the entire universe. Not because it was the most destructive force the galaxy had ever encountered, though its capabilities certainly proved formidable when genuinely tested. It shook the universe because it revealed, clearly and undeniably, that true strength has never been measured by the willingness to destroy, but by the wisdom and restraint required to protect, even when the power to do otherwise remains fully within reach. And once the wider galaxy finally understood this truth about humanity, nothing among the stars would ever be viewed quite the same way again.